You're listening to the Physio Matters podcast in association with rehabmypatient.com, and this is session 103. Welcome back to the Physio Matters podcast. I'm still Jack Chew, and I rarely get a chance to do these intros anymore because we're going to jump straight in on those Chewing It Over shows and other associated broadcasts. But we've got a special edition for you today because we've got a long-awaited conversation with Joanne Elphinston. About all things movement, her life's work about regarding beautiful movement, which I think is an absolutely fascinating topic that touches on the subjective, the objective, and everything in between. And so I won't hold you up. You will jump straight into that in a second, and I'll reflect a little bit on it at the end of the conversation. But it was a great pleasure to speak to Jo. We've had so many people in common over the years that we've worked with, and friends and colleagues and stuff that have said we should get together. And there's various reasons as to why we've just never ended up getting on the same microphones and stuff, some of which we might talk about. I'm sure it might be interesting to some of you, but yeah, it's been long awaited, and many of you have requested that we have a chat, and hopefully it doesn't disappoint. So I'd be really interested in your thoughts on this, and certainly it should inspire further conversations both between us two as well as then wider in the industry, because we all want to raise standards together, and it matters how much this stuff matters, and so we need to try and work it out. So thank you all for your time. Really appreciate it. Go to rehabmypatient.com/physio matters for a 3-month free trial of what we feel is the best exercise prescription software in the game, especially when it comes to speed of access. We know how time consuming these things can sometimes be, and how every moment with your patient is valuable, and therefore the ability to do this so quickly, especially because they love the integration with WhatsApp, the ability to send it over to WhatsApp. Most people are using that. Most patients are using that now. So that has been and proven very popular. But thanks to them for supporting the podcast and supporting all that we do over at Physio Matters. They are the best in the biz, and we could not do what we do without them. So do support them if you support us. But anyway, enough from me. Me and Jo chat for over an hour, I think, and I will reflect on it a little bit in the outro. See you at the other side. I'm delighted to be here with Joanne Elphinston, a long-awaited podcast in many ways, to do this as a Physio Matters special, to explore all things beautiful movement with someone that I don't know if necessarily coined those words going together, but I think I've heard her name associated to that phrase more than anyone else in the industry and beyond. It's brilliant to do this. For those eagle-eyed viewers that are not just listening but watching, this is the first one from our new podcast studio in our new premises. However, don't tell Mrs. Chew, but I've not managed to get all things on the wall that make it look as pretty as it will do. So come back for when I've finally got round to doing that. But it is nice to be here, and everything seems stable. The internet's sort of behaving itself, and we seem to have a good connection. So I'm delighted to be here with Jo. And really, the first question that I know everyone's going to be interested in is your background and journey, if you don't mind, Jo. That would start us off.
Well, thank you, Jack. It is an absolute delight to be here with you. A real pleasure. And so, yeah, I'm looking forward to this. So, background and journey. Okay, so I'll try to be succinct because it's not easy when you've been around as long as I have. So I started out actually thinking I was going to be a vet. That turned around, and then I took a swerve into architecture because I wanted to re-embrace my creative self, and then decided, oh, I see, this involves being very much on my own, drawing straight lines. Not my thing. So I found my way back to physiotherapy, which at that time I was an unexceptional student for the first couple of years. Could not work out what they wanted at all. Worked really hard, never could work out what they wanted until I got together with patients, and then it made sense. But I really didn't think I was going to be a physio beyond about 4 years. Kind of thought I'll give this 4 years and then we'll kind of move on. But actually ended up, if any of you, okay, if I look at my background, I would say it's a history of always being a bit out of step. A bit always on the outside, a bit always saying, yes, but what about that? So I know that you have a lot of people out there who probably relate to that, and that is my history. And Gotcha. It very much informs how I've ended up where I am now, because I've had to find a way to be able to reconcile that and still be able to find a way to be me, bring my best and do what I care about. So you know, it didn't take very long in the hospital system to realize this is probably not my thing. And at that age, I think I was 22. I'm like, right, 6 months, I'm going to be overseas in a private practice on double my income. That was my goal. And in 6 months, I was in a private practice in Honolulu, watching whales jump while I treated somebody's neck. So if only all of life worked out that way. But anyway, what it got me was a place where I had a lot of freedom. And for some people early in their career, that's not a good thing. For me, it was essential. And I was in the States and I was exposed to so many ideas that just still haven't seen the light of day in Australia. I mean, Australia is quite like this, if I'm honest. And I found it very constricting. But getting to the States, I was in a clinic where I was actually given a lot of freedom after I'd actually had it out with the boss about, this prescription thing. It's not what I do. Lots of freedom all the way into my first burnout. Hurrah. And then recovering from said burnout and then realizing it's time to move on and I'm going to give up physiotherapy. So I sold everything and grabbed my backpack and flew to Athens and made my way across the Mediterranean without really a plan other than something will happen. And it ended me in the UK. And that was accidental. I had written on a page 2 years before, if I went back to study, what would I want to study? I'd already been accepted for masters in exercise physiology and it didn't float my boat. I'd written down music, philosophy, Italian, all these eclectic things that didn't go together. And there, in a page in The Guardian, was an advertisement for a brand new multidisciplinary masters in music, culture and politics. And that's what brought me and settled me here. So that was the best year, apart from the 18 hours a week I was working in the NHS, where I showed up on the first day and they said to me, so are you a Mackenzie, a Maitland or a Syriac therapist? And I went, I don't understand the question. Surely you're a whatever works, because I was coming with all this movement stuff and fascial work and muscle energy and all this cool stuff from the States. I was actually prevented from spreading these subversive ideas to junior staff. The response was simply to wait till the seniors went home and do secret in-services afterwards, after hours. And so that's kind of where it began. I mean, seriously. I mean, it's just
bootleg training sessions, like you were selling moonshine that you'd just made from home in a department or something. Well, Prohibition.
It was like that because, I even tried to make it work in their language. It was a very Mackenzie orientated department. And there's no criticism with that. It's just that like nothing else. And so I tried to explain the biomechanics of the movements they were using and try and link it that way. No, not having that. And I'd have all these juniors, bless them, they'd be in tears. They didn't know what to do with the patients and they'd get told, do retractions, and then it doesn't work, do retractions with overpressure. And there was nothing else. And it was the rate of antidepressant use amongst junior and senior, back then, juniors and senior twos, they were called. It was off the charts. They were really in trouble. These people who had graduated full of hope, and enthusiasm and wanting to help people, and they were just drowning in the system. And so, if the only way to help that is secret after school in-services to explore things like normal movement, functional anatomy, things that were deemed too subversive at the time.
Right.
That's kind of where that started.
And that's where was that sort of where as well that you became interested in a peer educator then? So you were clearly doing some of that and then needing to sort of not chalk that up as being something that needed to be a framework of which to educate people, but just realizing that you had both an interest and talent for that.
Yeah, I guess before that, my first ever teaching wasn't peer teaching. It was actually for the Honolulu Parkinson's Association. My first ever. And it was probably about 1993. And normally they just got a talk from the doctor about medication and that would be it. And I turned up with a ukulele and a friend and we sang songs and we did movements and they were like, oh. And when I got to the UK, I actually started off teaching muscle energy to peers.
Right.
But it was actually that seminal moment, these secret in-services, that tapped me into something more, which was not just educating peers, but the purpose of educating them. You know, and it's been a passion all the way along, and it hugely informs GEMS, is creating a safe space for clinicians to show up and say, I don't know this, but I'd like some help with that, and to be able to share with them the wonder of what we can do.
Right.
Because do you know what? I just see the stress and the pressure and not the magic. And so it was both things of like, these are things that you need to know to be able to help you and your patients to find your way back into the wonder of what we can do together.
Right.
So yeah, I would say it was a kind of a seminal moment around the emotional and psychological well-being of clinicians, but also how it came together with this other way of working.
The more over the years I've encountered and been in touch with not just your work, your book, but also then all the colleagues of which we are and friends we have in common and the ways in which they practice, is that I describe you as being so inherently fascinated by movement to this day. What is it that fascinates you, if indeed that is the case?
It's such a big question, Jack. I think it's been something I have had in me since childhood in many ways. I couldn't see when I was a kid. And when I say I couldn't see, I mean, I could see this far, but I couldn't see any further. But nobody knew I couldn't see because I was a well-behaved child who did their homework. Nobody knew I couldn't see anything.
Right.
And I had to recognize people by the way they moved. And I didn't know that at the time. But it also meant that I had to really sense things in my body. And that's happening when we're moving. And so it goes back a long way. But I think for me, movement is, it is so much a representation of who we are and how we're showing up and how we feel about ourselves. You know, I think one of the things that happens clinically is we somehow carve that off and don't think it's relevant. And yet it is so relevant. You know, and when either through something that I do, or I mean, I'm very into moving the brain to get, you know, different outputs happening in the body. And when we're moving the brain, what we're doing is we're looking at how can we interrupt predictive processing loops to change something. Well, we're going to harvest associations and memories and intentions and all of these things that are representative of that unique person. And they embody it in how they carry themselves and how they move. So it's so intensely human movement. And when I look at people who've come, you know, to courses, they say, I know about movement. And I'm like, but they don't. They know about exercises. That is a different thing altogether. You know, you can do
Right.
an exercise. It doesn't necessarily change how you feel about yourself as a person. But if I can help someone, I think I gave you an example last time we spoke about an older lady and in gait and feeling, you know, it was a struggle. And she was telling me about the pain and the awkwardness. But it was also a lot about who she was and how she felt about herself. And by the time she left, she could tell, you know, I actually feel quite elegant. And wow, what's going to make the difference to her? Just feeling a bit less awkward or actually going out going, do you know what? I'm still an elegant woman. That makes me feel differently about myself. And what a gift that is. And
Right.
movement, that was a direct route there. That wasn't talk therapy. That was reclaiming something that's inherently her.
Mm. when we think about the act of that's not even the act of movement. If we think about movement in all of its forms, be that conceptually, in action, there's all sorts of different things that do it. And I can so imagine that being an ability for you to express yourself artistically through demonstration as an educator. It's something that has it's inherently endless in terms of it's not a well contained concept of which can then be constrained and need nor should it be. But the risk, I suppose, I've observed over the years, not necessarily with your work, but just broadly, I suppose I'll admit that when I've explored it to its nth degree, both conceptually and in practice, is that then there is a vulnerability to it feeling a little too vague in order to be enacted properly, in ways that then would be at least tolerable to the system, in a sense that when we're practicing as therapists and we might be making suggestions, that there's a rigidity to prescriptive exercise, which is, as you rightly said, is distinct from what we're describing. But there is something that is there is a je ne sais quoi that is to movement that is so difficult to pinpoint, that means that then that vagueness can sometimes feel difficult to implement, particularly within the healthcare and the medical system, of which in MSK being the center of my world, somewhat sometimes independent to performance, except on a functional performance level. I find that that's something that I know many of our listeners, and myself included, have struggled with over the years, is that sometimes things feel so vague and so non-distinct that they really then feel only useful in the theoretic and the abstract, and it's really difficult to sort of embody them. Is that something that you've ever encountered personally, or is it something that really you've never really felt like you needed to find edges? Everything's just always sort of worked well together. I just wondered, both as a person, and then whether or not you've encountered that concern in any of your students and colleagues over the years.
A great question, Jack. And it's why, I mean, I'm a big believer in the balance between having a structure and a framework and that holds the spaces. So a lot of people come to me saying, I was trying to put patients in boxes and now I understand they're webs. And it's just like, but webs have an inherent structure. So, for example, I can teach anybody, I can teach kids how to look at movement in a really structured way before we get into like the really, like, I mean, I spent a lot of my career doing high performance work, and you can get very nuanced there. But interestingly, with almost all of them, we've had to start with the basics. So, ask any GEMS practitioner, okay, what's the first thing? Well, I need to see, have they got a central longitudinal axis? Okay. It's an imaginary line, a reference point going through the body. But if you haven't got that, then everything is a negotiation. Now, that's easy to see. And I can show a patient. I had one the other day, he came in lurching from side to side. And I said, would you like to see yourself? Would I film you on your phone? And so I did, and said, what do you notice? He says, oh, I really do. Like, what is that with the side to side? I'm like, well, that is an interesting question that you have here. And it really relates to your particular pain presentation, your back pain. And just explained, that actually walking is a rotational exercise. People don't realize that. They think it's like tin soldier, sagittal plane exercise. It's not. It's a rotation from the ground, and it ripples in a rotation all the way up. So we're rotating our way over the ground, one side over the other. And I said, but you can't rotate if you don't have an axis. I mean, look at your car. Like, your wheels need an axis to turn around. Like, it's just a physical principle. There's nothing woo-woo about it. So equipped with that information, let's see what happens. Well, bless him, he came back the next week. He was completely different. And he's like, yeah, well, I realized I have been doing all that lurching, and it does put more pressure on that side. So I've really thought about just, having a line and then seeing if I can just move forward through it. Now, I've given him one concept. Now, I can tell you about all of the biomechanical and neuromuscular configurations that are going to happen as a result of that. But he doesn't need to know that unless he's interested. So that is all of this, we are evolutionary. We have an evolutionary inheritance, and that inheritance was to work with the physical forces under which we operate. And this is the other thing that's really interesting, is that in our effort to be so objective, we just kind of completely forget that the way we evolved was to work with things like ground reaction force, gravity, friction. These are basic physics phenomena that we use through our nervous system, through our fascial system, in order to actually move ourselves through the world. That's basic physics. Yeah, it's nothing.
May I use that as an example, Joe, just to pick on
Yeah.
and I'd really be interested in how you see that. So when you make the suggestion you do to that fella from your
Mm.
assessment and from a suggestion then as to how he might relate to his body, and he then, be that through instruction or just takes it upon himself to act on that, to realize and then make improvements, functional improvements that he then relates to, and they're visible, they're described. He might have a symptomatic relief from such things. Do you consider that to be one of many things of which you could have said that would have got to that? Or do you feel that the specificity of what you've observed and then given him to do or suggested he might do, or that he's taken upon himself to do, was actually something that he needed to hit somewhere nearer the bullseye than I described with the 10 other options type thing? I just wondered how you see those things. Are they corrective?
When you say corrective, that's some, so I was with you until you say, are they corrective? And suddenly it went on a swerve, Jack. Do you
Okay,
want
we can separate those. I suppose the corrective bit could be then the follow up. I should have held back, but yeah, it's that are they? Well, it's kind of if we're describing now that I've said it, the corrective is it a fault of which has been corrected? Is the movement dysfunction that you've then observed something that has then been corrected? But also, I sort of stand by my initial framing of it as to what is it you've, I guess I'm asking as to the specificity, aren't I?
I guess so. I think, are you saying that there could have been 10 things I could have offered or seen and I picked that one? Was that what you were
Do you
saying with that
sense do
first
you
part?
sense that do you sense that in those instances there were 10 things and you picked one of 10, or do you sense that maybe there were two or three, or that there was one and that you observed the one that was required?
Well, basically, I'll usually go for what is most central and simplest. There will have been a lot of different things, but as long as he is continuing to do that particular motion, then those things actually can't change. So, can give him hip abductor exercises and glute bridges. None of it's actually going to change anything, because ultimately, this is the thing that often doesn't get understood. To get muscles to work as you want them to, you need to get the right bit to the right part at the right time. If you actually put the body there, everything shifts, which is why a lot of the gym's work is about getting automatic responses from the body, which is basically uncovering what is already there as potential, but the brain can't get to it. So in this case, and in many cases, so for example, shoulder patients is a good one. So that axis again, if you want to be able to access the broader connections from the shoulder, you need to be able to access the trunk. And so the trunk, again, that axis gives you the ability to access all of that. So I've got somebody doing some kind of resisted shoulder activity, but he's standing in a side bend for whatever reason. It could be because he sprained his ankle years ago and he's shifted off that leg, and this is how it's all kind of gone. We don't know. All we can deal with is what's in front of us.
Right.
And I say to him, right, you're doing the resistance. What are you noticing? Well, I feel it all around my shoulder, blah, 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 blah. Okay, all right then. So why don't you find that foot, grow up to the ear on that side, which just brings him into a place where he's kind of a bit more centered. Now do it again. What do you notice now? Oh, I said, what does R mean? So where are you noticing the effort? He said, oh, now it's in my middle of my body. Oh, how's the shoulder? Oh, that's much less. Okay, so what have we done? Have we changed the shoulder? No, but we have changed the environment for the shoulder to be able to operate more effectively. And that's happened automatically. And if I had little sensors, you'd see changes in what was activating and how. but trying to make it happen without giving it a foundation and an environment for it to be able to do so, it's just not going to happen.
The feedback that you get that makes you feel that that is an improvement is one that I'm trying to make sure I understand, because there is a vulnerability to a correlation causation issue whereby the post hoc feedback we often get from a patient that something feels better or even different can sometimes be the evidence that would then fuel the theory in the first place that that was the problem. But you've always got this frustrating variable, which is that something changed. So what was it that mediated the difference between them before and after your suggestion? What I want to try and understand is whether or not within a spectrum of vague, I guess, you've got the opportunity where there's a hyperspecificity that means that then the fault needs to be identified as accurately and precisely as possible as a movement dysfunction. And that therefore a resolution of that is fundamental to the foundations of that person's movement, and it's likely to have sequelae elsewhere in the kinetic chain, or even more so an extreme of that position is that, you know, if you don't resolve the ankle mobility on your contralateral foot, then no wonder you've got away in your jaw, right? And I'm not necessarily being silly with that example, right? There's a plentiful school of thought that you're going to then just deteriorate. And then the other extreme of that would be that then people would feel that we are so infinitely malleable that essentially that movement habits are only movement quirks like our fingerprints are, and that essentially your body's so adaptable that it won't necessarily matter how you move, and that we simply, when we're observing people, these are just interesting kinematic quirks of that individual that don't necessarily need to be changed from, and that actually if you get a symptomatic change or an efficiency change or a performance change that comes from the suggestion you've made, then that doesn't necessarily you've actually corrected anything, you've just done something differently. And that's why research is useful for us to differentiate those two things. I'm trying to place you best I can within that spectrum, even within a window, not narrowly, but I'm just trying to understand as to whether or not you feel that the specificity that I described to its extreme, or the vagueness as I described it to its extreme. I just wondered what your take was as to how essential it is that we correct or change to one degree or another the things you've observed in these examples.
Okay, great, Jack. So I think the first place that we can find our freedom here is that I never use, not since I did like a book that I published a long time ago, but never anymore consider dysfunction, fault, and therefore not correction. Yeah. Because frankly, all you're seeing is the nervous system outputting one of a palette of options. And we don't have a problem with that unless we get stuck with that being the only option. So most of our patients don't have the variability. So, and that's what you're helping them find. What you're doing here is interrupting the brain to say, listen, that is the way you usually do it. But look, there's another possibility that you could be putting your hand on here. So when we come out of it's a fault and into that's just one of many options, but we're not using the rest of the if you have like a box of colored pencils, it's just like you're only using red. So my job is actually to help the nervous system to find a way to access all the other possibilities so that it can make better choices based on the nervous system and how we sense ourselves to use the option that best matches that scenario. So how can we be most efficient, most safe, and most at ease in that particular task, context, scenario? Based on the sensory information, I now understand what I'm sensing. So, for example, my patient, many of them, but let's take a really common population for me, which is the hypermobile patient.
Right.
They are not well served still in the community. No, sure. Because people still don't realize that you have to start with the fundamental issue is when you cannot sense yourself and you cannot sense the body part relationships and where I am, then anything else you do makes no sense at all to the brain. So, I get lots of people who've been given strengthening. Oh, that's okay. But if you still don't know that your top half and your bottom half, have one's here and one's here, and they could be here if you want to push hard or pull hard, it kind of works better here. But I'm not telling you it's going to work better. I'm going to invite you to find out where you are and find out where it actually feels stronger. You tell me where it feels stronger, not me telling you. This is the thing that therapists have to get over, is that business of being the expert. And we tell you what will be best for you. And I was going to say something probably not good language there, so I'm going to pull back for a moment and just say it's garbage. This is one of the things we've got to get over ourselves about.
You can say bullshit on this show if that was going to be your choice.
Oh, good, because that's kind of where I was going with it.
Thought so. Could see it in your eyes.
Yeah, I was trying to be polite, but no, but it is. And it's one of the things that I think is both the huge cause of stress amongst therapists of feeling like they have to be that person.
Right.
With all the answers. And then they're like, oh, well, I'm not doing well enough because I gave the patient this exercise and it didn't work. I'm like, I'm so interested in it didn't work. Like, what makes you think it didn't work? Well, it turns out that the patient didn't give them feedback that aligned with their agenda.
Right.
My agenda is that I'll give the patient the exercise and they should tell me they really feel their glutes working, but they didn't. So either we make it about the patient or we make it about ourselves. Oh my gosh, I should have done that better. I should have thought of something else. What was another cue? And that's one of those moments when I'm just like, look, with all due respect, it's not all about you. And that kind of can be a bit affronting, like, oh, no, it's all about the patient. I'm like, it's not. Because if it was all about the patient, you'd sit there and go, oh, how interesting. That's just information. So what does it tell me next? What is my next adaptation? Their nervous system has put this suggestion out as the best interpretation of whatever your instructions were, and you didn't get that outcome. So stay in the process. What's the information here? Step back. Oh, actually, this person takes a whopping big in-breath before they try and do anything. Well, what does that do? Well, it facilitates their erector spinae and their hamstrings. They can't get to their glutes. So great. Sort that out. Okay, it still doesn't happen. It's okay. It's a journey. This is what's so cool. If we could be okay about not just going from point A to point B and thinking that that's how it should be, bless us that we think that that's how it should be with humans who are limitlessly unique, have utterly unique backgrounds, histories, whatever. Why the heck should they just output to that particular cue that you did? Why is that what we think is okay? And why is that what we predicate our performance on?
Right.
Utterly unrealistic. But if we get back to, it's just information, what does it tell me about my next step? Then
do you think that when you observe someone moving and you therefore through your examination, your instincts, your history observing such things before, your previous experiences, you therefore suggest some cues and then retest, and you create and observe various different things that both subjectively and objectively give you then that feedback. We've described some examples. Do you see, whilst it's not a correction, do you see that is something that then is just giving them more movement variety, and therefore you're able to both distribute the forces more evenly or differently across the body in such ways that they might be more comfortable if we're treating and managing injury, or might be noticeably something that you could explore as a means of furthering your functional performance, be that in sport or in life? Or do you see that as being something that, if not, be it not resolved, those would have biomechanical sequelae that is more likely in time to provoke more challenges in someone's life, even if we're not going to call them dysfunctions?
So, Jack, are you saying that if we change the movement, could we create a problem later on? I'm just trying to get
to some extent. I'm meaning no. I'm more saying that if we don't, I'm saying what's the consequence of not? Like be these problems that we might have observed or things that we've noticed, be them unresolved. Does that have consequences? Or just is it your take that whilst we're not calling them dysfunctions, these narrow movement patterns, someone's only got one when they could have 5 different ways in which they're reaching overhead. And we are trying to unblock that and give them more movement variety. Do you have an opinion as to then, be that unresolved, would that then, if not further their problem, lead to further, even more problems if it wasn't to be improved upon?
Yeah, so that's what I would invoke something I call the functional window. So you've got functional capability and the functional demand. And as long as your capability is greater than or equal to the demand, you haven't got a problem. So we all know examples of people who move in all kinds of funky ways and they're fine. And it's just like, well, yeah, well, if what they have from a force kind of aspect on their body is not beyond what they can actually handle, then it's not a problem. But it is a problem once you want to actually take your functional window and grow it. So you either want to do it, bigger, harder, longer, faster, whatever, often without sufficient adaptation time. So we see a lot of that. I call it significant birthday syndrome. It's just like, I've turned 40, I shall run my first marathon. I've turned 50, I shall climb Kilimanjaro. And I will do it with, having not done any of that before, with way too little preparation time and way too little adaptation time. So, a sudden increase in that functional window or functional demand where your capability hasn't actually expanded to match it. So, if you reach overhead in a funky way, but you don't actually have to do that very often, probably won't lead to a problem. But if you do have to do it really often, then maybe that could become problematic simply because, and this comes back to a fundamental question that I use as a teaching, a start point is, well, why is that structure under pressure? Not like we're pretty good at finding where the problem is. I hate the fact that so often we're happy to call it overload. I just think that is so lazy. It's not overload or overuse. I'm like, really? I mean, overuse, we accept that as, oh, this is because of overuse. And I'm afraid I call bull on that too. It's just like, well, my patients know better than that. Oh, I've been told I've got an overuse injury in my Achilles, but I've only got it in my right Achilles and my left runs as far as my right. So I've only got it in my right Achilles. Excellent question.
And I'm using it a lot less than my peers right now. And so why would that be? Yeah, it's an interesting way that we use language for stuff like that.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I see a lot of people with supposed overuse injuries, but if we come back to why is that structure under pressure, and I come back to gait, for example, I'll use a patient, but she's a model of many patients. So she's got an Achilles issue on her left side. She's an Ironman triathlete, goes a long way, has had all sorts of interventions, has had all the evidence-based practice. She's eccentric the hell out of it and then concentric the hell out of it and done all sorts of things. She's still got a problem. But when you look at her and she's moving, then she only rotates to the right. And if you only rotate to the right, you keep pushing your weight to the left. So, and when you look at her weight is orientated through the left. Her ground contact times are way longer on the left. And she has to shift more body weight off that left because she hasn't got the left rotation, which actually facilitates push off and shifts the weight back to the center. She hasn't got those things because she only turns to the right. So what do? Well, we help her turn to the left and then find out where that weight is going now. So it's wavering around somewhere in the center as she runs. She's got half a chance of taking the load off that left side, decreasing the ground contact times, and actually then getting all the neuromuscular responses around that working. It's not enough to say it's overuse. Yeah, we can see that, but why? And that's what movement can help us with.
Because I can follow that logic biomechanically, no problem. And I can also understand what you're meaning in terms of what is the underlying reason as to why something will be overloaded, overused, feeling more pressure, changing the ground reaction forces in terms of creating an asymmetry, for want of a better term, on the last one. But then we do end up in a vulnerability to the fact that then be by improving upon that, by doing various things that would improve that symmetry to rotation, the feedback we then get to resolve the symptoms, which is what they're wanting to do, which of course is the center of the bullseye. We end up with this challenge where there is that she assumedly hasn't got an identical twin of which has lived exactly the same life to provide us with a control group that still moves that way. And so I suppose it's just do you see the things that have been improved upon as being the mediator to change, or was it that there was just a whole bucket of different things, the environment, the context, the having seen someone, an esteemed expert such as yourself, that had helped to then resolve that, having seen many other people, be that the other non-specific effects that are different this time that have then assisted the resolution of this problem in such a way that then potentially she may well not have moved biomechanically any differently, but could still have resolved that problem. Because then this is where you end up in this really interesting thing where I'm trying to work out it's a challenge for all of us to work out what are the mediators for change. But I'm definitely just trying to pick out whether or not how you perceive what has been the secret, what has been the special sauce that has then helped resolve that problem.
Well, I would say that there's a little bit, and okay, don't take this the wrong way. There's a bit of grasping for denial there going on there, Jack. Because let's say, I mean, in this particular individual situation, highly trained, like most of the factors are what they are. Is there a placebo effect from coming to see me? Well, to be honest, when she came to see me, I mean, I was just someone said, oh, you should probably go and see Joe because you haven't tried that. She's tried everything and she's been to some really, really top people who have given her lots of advice. And we've given her a reason for why it's a hypothesis, not a reason. It can only ever be a hypothesis. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go with, all right, so when you do it this way, what is your sensory experience of that on all of these different parameters? Could be your comfort. We find that suddenly they've got different stride lengths, they've got different speed to effort ratios. We've had people's VO2 maxes change with all sorts of stuff. Has been very interesting. When you've got access to elite athletes, you do actually have access to some interesting measurable things that you can look at. So when it gets right down to it, nothing that she's tried before has helped. This has. Does it matter?
Being that case, I totally understand. And that's where I don't want to come across as if, of course, and the vulnerability that comes from, does it matter if it works, is more on the macro level than on the individual level, because on the individual level, we've resolved it. I think in this instance, of course, if there's study it to high heaven, if you notice there's actually nothing else changed but for the improvements in rotation that have translated biomechanically to running, then again, you're trying to torch your logic to try and find something, and you understandably could say that I'm in denial. I think in the broader sense, though, when it comes to observation of movement difference, that's when it becomes something that becomes relevant. And I think on the macro, it definitely ends up being something that's hyper relevant. An example that's used well by Todd Hargrove, who might be aware of his work, and his book Guide to Better Movement. And he wrote an interesting blog around that time. I don't think it's in the book. It's actually a blog that I recall, where he said that if we weren't bothered about why something works or what mediated recovery, then the vulnerability we had of old was that we used to torture people under sports massage, thinking we were making a massive difference to their tissues. And so once people realize that actually sometimes it feels nice to have a massage because it feels nice to have a massage, then the mechanism of effect really matters as to how we actually deliver that intervention. So in this instance, beyond the one example, I find it does matter what mediates recovery, because the specificity can sometimes lead us down a path whereby we end up spending a lot of time distracting ourselves with the stuff that matters less than we thought. So in practice, I find myself exploring a lot of this, but doing as little as possible to mediate recovery as a means of then distancing myself from that solution, because it mattered far less than we might have thought. And so in high performance situations, you be specific when you need to be specific. But if we sometimes think that those specific mediators are really central to recovery, I think we can sometimes overindulge our own and be distracted by something that ends up being a bit too niche, and that by doing something differently for a bit, then that's often enough, and sometimes can empower a patient to realize that there wasn't something that needed to be examined to high heaven, because it makes them feel more resilient and more robust for the future.
Possibly. I think that, yes, that takes me back to, if you're interrupting a fixed pattern and giving people a palette of options, that's exactly it. But also it speaks to our attachment to needing to be always in control. And I find that really interesting as clinicians, because when I'm starting with something, I've given you a basic biomechanical thing. The reality is it's a start of a 10. We're going to make a shift here. And then we're going to see where we go next. Okay, so I tried to, because of the overwhelm of thinking things were vague, what I did was I zeroed down on something that was just a purely mechanical thing.
Yeah.
But the reality is it is a start of a 10. The first win is simply to elicit some kind of change. So I could have just as easily, and so, for example, that was something we needed to get to. To get to it, though, we had the issue of the fact that she had a breathing pattern that kept separating her upper torso from her lower torso. She couldn't have an axis. So we needed to learn how to breathe. So what happens? We learn how to breathe. We start to actually affect our sympathetic parasympathetic relationship. That's shifting too. You're shifting a whole environment, but you keep referring back to the sensory experience of the patient. It's respecting that the patient here is the major agent in this, not us. And, when we keep coming back to our need for control all the time and come to the patient as the agent, then it's a major shift in how we start to look at things. So yeah, whether it's something in the mind, in the autonomic nervous system, we teach people, we've got this holistic functional model. It's very simple. But it's where is your entry point to help? Because they're coming to you because they want something to be different to how it is. Well, that's the definition of change. We are change agents. That's our job. The worst thing we can do is try stuff and nothing changes. Worst possible thing. So what we train people to do is, okay, have a look at these rings and go, which one of those ones do you reckon is probably going to be your best shot to help this person's nervous system somehow to experience change? So if that is the autonomic nervous system, and these days it often is, then that's what we need, because basically if you've got your sympathetic drive going on, you've locked out your nervous system from change. You need a relatively calm, receptive state for something to actually dare to change. Otherwise, it's right, we're surviving now, so you know what? We're not going to change anything. And the therapist is there trying to have change happen, and the patient's sympathetic nervous system is going, no, not having it. In which case, it doesn't matter what you do, and it's a waste of time for both of you. So they get given some exercises, hoping it might make a difference, and they come back and they do different, and around you go.
Especially if it's not meaningful for them or their needs.
Yeah. And I think, this is what really interests me, is that when we shift our need for everything to be under control and put it back to, how do we help this person to experience some kind of change that can start the ball rolling to help them to get to somewhere other than where they are today? That's a very different role. That is not us fixing them. That is not us nailing down and controlling for every blinking variable that we can't, and we don't have a right to either. Can I just say, from an ethical point of view, we don't have a right to be nailing down everything that person is experiencing. And we don't think about that very often. What's happening in that person's life is theirs. If they choose to share that with us and it's relevant, then if we have the skills to work with that, then great. But, you know, it's not for us to think that we have a right to control for all of that or to judge it, which basically we do in the research by saying, oh, well, we'll put it in this box.
Mm.
Um, you know, if I've got somebody, and again, I'm giving basics for examples here, but how we're embodying our emotions is utterly individual. And
Sure.
it's just not on for us to go, you know, oh, it's stress. The patient's pain is like gets worse because they're stressed. Because that then just makes it feel like it's in the patient's head. And it's not, because let's talk about a specific scenario for that patient. When are you feeling stressed? I'm feeling stressed before I go into a meeting. Okay, so show me, where does your body go when you're feeling that? Does it go up, down, in, out? What happens? And then they show me the embodiment. I'm like, so this is the thing. Your body is not separate from your brain. It is a distributed brain. It's all about how you're expressing. So you might think you're hiding this, and your body is speaking it, and it is going into this is how you embody it. So it's not in your brain, it's not in your mind, it's not imaginary, it's not a weakness. It is simply how your body is expressing this emotional experience that you're having. Now, I can work with that with you now that we're aware of it, because when that happens and you notice, I don't know, you notice that either you go up here and then your low back pain starts to come, or your shoulders are up. That's an obvious, easy one. Just like it's normal and it's natural, but it's not helping you. So now that you're aware of it, when you feel that, now you know what it is. Now, what can you do as an alternative? And we work together on what is the alternative. And that has been completely led by them, normalized their experience, not pathologized it, not called it non-specific. I love that. We have all that about non-specific pain. And it's like non-specific in whose language is that?
Yeah, I've got a thing where I riff on the fact that there's no such thing as non-specific, and you get some people that start cheerleading that, and if they don't listen to what I then go on to say, which is that because everything is, of course, specific to the individual of which experiences it. But people often know that the term non-specific means structurally non-specific, pathology
Mm.
non-specific, of which then has its place, but it comes from research, and we kind of overuse it and abuse it in clinical practice sometimes because it's a category error of a sorts. But people often meaning tissue non-specific, aren't they? When they really recognize that from our understanding as we do now is that, of course, the last thing it is non-specific. It's actually highly specific. It's actually just more specific than we're comfortable with as
Yeah.
clinicians because it's the category of one.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I do like look at the way things are going, and it speaks more and more to clinician or professional insecurity than necessarily patient care. And okay, I'm going to say that and put it out there and wait for all the howls of indignation to come at me.
I think
But
there's definitely plenty in that, and I know that whilst we might not have time today, yourself and Joe Turner have been talking a bit about off the back, and you saw some posts that you put on LinkedIn as well about this, about AI and the natural challenges and the bristles that have come from us therapists because of the robots some coming for our jobs. And Joe's written a piece for MSK Mag on this subject, so I understand that we're maybe rounding up on another chat on another platform about that, maybe potentially the three or more of us. So definitely one for another day there. I wanted to make sure that I just clarify as well that your point about control and a therapist wanting control over a patient. I think it's interesting because I think that that probably speaks a little to what I was meaning about how when we observe something that we feel is likely the mediator for change, be that whether we're right or wrong, I suppose I perceive that as being when we centralize our own expertise to be based on that specificity. I fear that that's sometimes that we're just very vulnerable to fooling ourselves into that specificity, and it's something that could be at risk of wasting our time. So when you do hit the bullseye, and it certainly feels that way, and we get the result we need to, and we don't need to pore over why and know exactly why, and that we're trying to control for the why. It's more that then if you're needing and you're centering your own professional expertise in some of that specificity, I worry that if something's superfluous, you want to learn about it being superfluous as quickly as possible so you can participate in stuff that matters more with someone. And I think that that's something that I'm often navigating when I'm teaching or training or working with personal trainers, that they feel that if I don't correct someone's form infinitely per rep, then where is my expertise? And I'm like, well, in your ability to motivate them to be healthier. And but they kind of, there is a version of MSK therapy that kind of can't help itself but to think that the specificity of movement analysis, and then be that if we call it correction or otherwise, it's the act of persuading someone to do differently. It's the fact that they nailed that is where their expertise is. And I
Mm.
think that that's the bit where I want to agree with your point about control, but also think that that can sometimes speak to the point I was making, where I can understand why you felt I was sort of, I can't remember the word you used for it, but I was, where I was in denial. I was in denial
Grasping
that
for
there was wrong
denial
with.
is what I said.
No,
Yeah.
grasping for that was good, but can you see what I'm meaning about the control thing? Is that I can understand where it would look like I'm trying to be in control because I want to understand it to the nth degree, but I'm also admitting that I think that if it's overindulged, if we think we are more influential on the specific level than we are, I think that speaks to therapist control over just it's something's happening.
Well, hugely. And this is why I'm saying it's, try to get people to look at each individual therapy session as it's an unfolding story. It's not an A to B journey. And often clinicians will say to me, oh, I'm not good enough. And I'm like, what makes you say that? I should be able to get to the exact thing much faster. I'm like, really? What makes you think that? Why would you think that that's a good thing? And they've been led to believe that that is like that a master will get there. And I'm like, gee, so in your hurry to zero down, you've just zoomed past all of these other possibilities that are there instead of saying, listen, we're going to take a little journey here. And sometimes I had a patient, it was so funny. It wasn't that long ago. And he said to me in the session, he said, I'm so impressed by your tolerance of being able to be in a state of uncertainty for so long. I'm like, oh, that's a super cool thing to say, because it wasn't a clear thing and it was an unraveling. But instead of going, oh, that's not it. Oh, what next can I do? Oh, that's not it. It's just like, well, but each thing that I'm finding out more, and he's finding out more is very important. Again, it's
Yeah.
not just about what I'm finding out, it's what he's finding out, what he's contributing. And together we got to a really meaningful place. But it was a narrative that happened in that session. It wasn't just trying to get from A to B as fast as possible, and thinking that that's a good thing. Because as you say, Jack, there's so many factors. All you're doing is eliciting the possibility of getting the ball rolling. And then the two of you have got it, because you don't know when they're suddenly going to come out with some completely random thing they haven't thought about. And hasn't that happened to us all? I think, oh, wouldn't that have been good to know like 3 sessions ago? But, it couldn't, because that landscape wasn't put in place for the patient to make that realization.
Mm.
So what have you
Yeah.
done as a clinician? Oh, I haven't done anything. Yes, sure you have. You've actually created that landscape for that patient's understanding to get to a point where they've solved this for themselves. Is that not the best outcome? And the
Yeah. And
clinician's like, well, I kind of think it would be better if it was me that I figured it out.
yeah, we'd all rather that. I think it's astute of the patient to recognize that and compliment you on how comfortable you are on uncertainty. But done
Blown
properly,
away.
it's like I've spent a career doing that, because it's like my field is so uncertain, and people and patients often sort of perceive, unfortunately, that it's physics and mathematics rather than it being law and politics, in a sense that the MSK has its grounds and its roots in some of the hard sciences and physics and pharmacology even, or physiology, of which we might understand, but it has its vagueness and its generality, and it's so much is unknown and so many uncertainties, and it's so specific to the individual. That means that then, of course, it is infinitely different as to how where the answer might emerge, rather than it being sort of rote learned or understandable in a way that means that then it's just like, no, there is an answer. We go to plan B, which is definitive. We're going from one definitive thing to the next definitive thing, whereas actually uncertainty is sort of very central to what is a very young and emergent field, really, relative to many others.
Yeah, and you know what? I mean, if we go 100 years from now, humans are still going to be complex, individual, and unique. So we cannot stamp out uncertainty, but what we should do is see it as opportunity, not as a threat. People are like, oh, I feel really vulnerable and uncertainty. I'm like, yeah, because we've been trained to. We think it's wrong. It's
Yeah.
not wrong. It is the space of opportunity. It is the space of curiosity. It is the space of creativity. And with a patient, I would say co-creativity, co-curiosity.
Mm.
It is something that I am definitely not doing this alone. And when we start to see opportunity, okay, it's not all clear. And sometimes we're stressed and like the kids are sick at home and, the cat's gone to the vet and like there's a deadline and there's something else, and there's this truckload of stuff going on in our own lives. And we just need to get to a solution fast because do you know what? I don't have the bandwidth for this right now. All right. And we've got to get real with ourselves.
Yeah.
That sometimes that is happening. And that is no judgment because we are human too.
And that's yeah, no, that speaks to yours and mine. Your colleague Joe Turner saying things like why you matter and why that what you're bringing to any consultation is relevant for your own patience and tolerance for some of what we're describing and the intensity that that can bring, especially when it comes at a volume. I wonder if I could just ask, if would you say that beautiful movement is something that is just inherently worth aspiring to? That there is a an objective quality to what is a subjective variable of beauty. That is
Mhm.
something that when it comes to movement, there is something that if given the chance to aspire to or not, then it is worth aspiring to, even though there is so much unknown about
Mm.
beauty and of movement.
I would say yes. If we look at the kind of the pinnacle of with the range, so let's look at the pinnacle of human movement. So we've got the Olympics coming up. And all those people who are out there on social media land going, it doesn't matter how you move. I'm just like, tell that to those athletes because that's why they have technical coaches to help them to get the right bit to the right place at the right time, to access the forces and their own evolutionary heritage to get the kind of outcome. And we watch them and don't know about any of that. We just go, wow, wasn't that gorgeous? Look at the way that diver did that. Look at the way that runner moves. Look, when we say it, oh my gosh, that's beautiful. We inherently know this. We know it in ourselves when we watch these. We'll all be there glued to the Olympics and we'll see people who we know, and the only way we can describe it as is that they just move beautifully. And what it means, they are moving without impediment. They are moving with access to themselves. They are moving in such a way that they can access their potential. Well, that's no different to me, to my elderly patients.
Right.
No different at all. And I love when they come back and they give me the words for that. I feel more at ease in my body. I feel more peace in my body. I feel a little more elegant. I feel that I look more like I wanted to look. And they don't mean about look, they mean that they move in a way. One of my patients at the moment, he was an athlete as a young man. Now he's an exhausted father of 3 in his 40s. And somewhere along the line, it all went a bit pear-shaped, and now he's just like, and you can see it in how he feels about himself. And he says, because I move, I feel my feet now when I walk, it feels delicious. Like, how did I not feel my feet before? And they tell me this stuff about how they're connecting with their whole bodies and how it makes them feel about themselves.
Yeah, feel myself again is such a powerful phrase. Like when someone says that, feeling myself again.
Yeah.
And we used a slogan at one point. I haven't used it in a while, but it was like helping you be you again. It's just like we don't care what it is to be you. That's
Mm.
going to vary, but we want you to aspire to be you. When it comes to the Olympic disciplines, do you think that there's a range of those of which beautiful movement matters, or could be aspiring to beautiful movement would matter more? For example, I would say artistic gymnastics might be at one side of it, and marathon running might be at another. And in the middle of it, there's something like javelin. But I just wondered if you saw it that way, or you think actually no, that there is less of a distinction than I'm making.
Absolutely no distinction at all. I mean, if you look at who's going to win a marathon and you look at that motion, have a look at Kipchoge and look at him run. And there is no braking, there is no extraneous, any forces going anywhere that aren't just propelling him forward. It's seamless, it's metronomic, it's
Would we
smooth.
have said the same thing about if we were in a different generation? Because Kipchoge is a great example, but Gabriel Selassie had fairly inefficient biomechanics to the textbook, and Paula Radcliffe certainly did.
Mm-hmm. And then again, what you look at is you look at how they're actually putting their forces through the ground and back, how the ground reaction force is moving through their bodies. And you will see that there's an overall kind of like a global, aesthetic. But when you actually look at what's happening, they're usually very efficient. Or, and this is something, that we have to take into account, everyone's movement is the amalgam of multiple factors. And so if one factor isn't your strength, then you amplify a different factor, so it's not about having all factors the same. So, talking to, a elite middle distance runner, and we were like analyzing different runners all around the same speed and going, right, this one actually, he's not got, natural kick of speed, but he's got like fantastic, he's stronger. Okay. And this one is stronger, or so not as strong, but he's so mechanically efficient that he can make it happen. He can overcome other deficiencies. Like, he's physiologically not as peak as this guy, but he's so biomechanically efficient, he can compensate for that. And so
I fear that we may be mixing efficiency and beauty for a second, which I know.
Is there a difference?
If you're suggesting not, if you think that they're synonyms, then yeah, maybe I'm misunderstanding. But I was sort of talking about the sort of more inherent, when you see it, you know it, beauty that doesn't necessarily, because when just the example I was using with regards to Gabriel Selassie and Paula Radcliffe is that they can have a macro efficiency that was clear because they've managed to create something that their body's been able to achieve that very few humans ever have been able to, right? But it wasn't necessarily inherently beautiful like a gymnast or Roger Federer's forehand. And so I was just trying to make a distinction there whereby I would consider them to be distinct, is that you can have efficiency, biomechanical efficiency, that's not necessarily inherently beautiful. And I think you would get away with that in marathon running, Paula Radcliffe, Gabriel Selassie. You wouldn't have a Paula Radcliffe-esque movement efficiency but not movement beauty in artistic gymnastics, because it's somewhat inherent to where that matters for the discipline. That's why I was making that distinction.
Right. So in terms of something that is actually literally being marked on aesthetics, like, where you've got technical marks and you've obviously got, and the same thing with diving, there's going to have to be some kind of aesthetic marker. But I would say that unless your sport has a specific aesthetic marker, like I've seen people who like, there's like champion discus throwers, for example. These are big guys, and you look at the top guys, and to me, what they do is so beautiful because their ability to center their body weight to get maximum rotation for the minimum effort to get the greatest speed and the least stress on their body. It's this seamless, extraordinary thing to watch. With this incredible power output. And that's beautiful movement. They're not getting marked on aesthetics, but their ability to access everything, to let from them, all of those physical principles, letting that move through their body and out through their hand as the funnel and the conduit for that. I mean, to me, that is beautiful movement. So maybe we need to kind of come down to what is our definition of beauty.
So often the case, isn't it? You end up in definitional terms because it's something that, depending on what we're meaning with the words we're saying, is that if efficiency and beauty are synonyms, at least in this context, then why does that matter? And it's always a risk that I'm seen to be trying to split the difference on something that doesn't need splitting. But I suppose in that instance, I was just because even words like elegant, is an interesting one. These are known to be, or seem to be, not known to be is wrong, seem to be more subjective terms than something that is, it'd be more challenging. You'd have to sort of torture logic a little more to quantify beauty. Many have tried. Then compared to efficiency, of which efficiency in our language could be ascribed to the efficiency of an engine, to actually be how it the energy in, energy out of say a combustion engine or something could be described on its efficiency terms. So I suppose that's where I'm forever fascinated by the language. But I suppose in this instance, I was making a distinction that was more that on a spectrum of objectivity, I think you would find efficiency as a word and its main connotations to be nearer to an objective side of a spectrum than say beauty.
Yeah, and I think as clinicians, we need to kind of start to explore. There's objectivity and then there is meaning. And to me, the distinction between efficiency and beauty is meaning. So I know that when I watch somebody, to me, like beautiful movement is, for example, if I'm looking at a child who is willing to explore different movement experiences, with curiosity and boldness, trying something new, that's beautiful movement to me. And when I see an elderly person who is feeling confident to go out into the world, into, a world of other people's leashes and dogs and slippery pavements and whatever, and be able to do that is beautiful movement to me. Watching a construction worker who effortlessly lifts a load and can do that all day. See, and you watch them. Sometimes I've just watched them gone, wow, that's just seamless. But whenever I see,
and that's why they say beauty is relative. Beauty has to be relative for that reason, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And it's meaning and it's emotion. When we see something that we think, oh God, that was beautiful. What do we feel? I feel joy.
Yeah, sure.
And when I'm working with somebody who's accessing something in their bodies that they didn't think they could get to, or they didn't think they could get back to, or they were too old for, or whatever, what's really happening is something is happening emotionally in them when they encounter that experience in their body. Once we help them to learn to sense themselves, because in this era right now, more than ever, people are struggling to know how to sense themselves, because for a whole other set of reasons, because I get neurogeeky about this, about what switches on and what switches off in your brain under stress and blah, 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 blah. But let's just say, overall, people are really struggling to sense themselves. So if we start with that, can I safely sense myself? And not everybody can safely sense themselves. Can I just say that's a whole other subject? But so that I can sense myself to make sense of what I'm feeling, and that's my job, is to help them to make sense of what they're feeling. Then to invite them to find out whether there are other options. And then they get to experience it and have a feeling about it. Yeah, I agree. Can I measure it? Oh, I'm sure some psychologist will come up with a great scale of how to measure that. And hopefully I'm dead, because I'm never going to probably spend any time in my clinic giving my patient that particular questionnaire.
The dossier questionnaire that would come to even try to elicit the numbers from that. The meaning, the crisis of meaning that the world is facing, and the crisis of movement, or feeling embodied, is something that would be a fascinating thing for us to deepen and to explore, and to understand how that links to societal challenges and things, or especially if there is a bidirectional thing there, whereby we could treat some of that, of course, with an improvement in movement, quality, efficiency, beauty, whatever we might call it. I was fearful this might happen, Joe, but the time is getting away from us, I'm afraid. So I'm just going to, I can't believe it. Yeah, amazing. And as we suspected, one of hopefully future conversations. Could you just signpost people to where they can find out a little more about you, particularly, websites, anything like that would be useful, and especially within that, what do you think is the best way for people that want to understand this more? What's the sort of particular resource would be a really useful starter for 10 beyond this podcast, of course?
Okay. So I would say, obviously the trainings that we offer. So I've got a new one launching in August. These are basically, as you would expect, they're a deeper dive. I create a bigger container for people to, I'm not interested in fast food patching holes, because people are compulsively trying to patch up
Yeah,
holes.
I want a quick and dirty elbow technique. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
yeah,
This is
yeah,
actually, this is about change within the therapist as well as the
yeah.
patient. And
Sure.
it's about actually learning the details, obviously, of how these things can go together and how we can be comfortable with something being complex but not complicated.
Right.
So if they want to find out more about that training, then if they hop onto the website is gemsmovement.com, go /learn gems, it will tell you about that. I am not a prolific social media poster, I must confess, but I am to be found on LinkedIn, Gems on Facebook, very little on Instagram, or they can have a little read of, hang on a minute,
It looks like it's been censored because
it's
of the
been
blurring of
censored.
Joe's. They've got it
There we
there.
go.
Power and yes, the power and
Power
the
and the
grace.
Grace, which is, they can get that at Singing Dragon. And I have actually procured, oh, hang on a minute. I'm back. Hang on. I have actually procured a discount for you guys,
Oh,
which is in uppercase ELPHIN 12, and that's on singingdragon.co.uk. And that book was not written to be a clinical book, but it's written to be a way to bring together these pieces, the beginnings of bringing together these pieces in a coherent way and in language that your patients would be able to easily understand.
superb. No, that's brilliant. Thank you. Because that's a great point as well, and one for another day, where there's that translation piece whereby even some of the things we've talked about today, although hopefully not too highbrow, because I'd have certainly got lost if we'd have ended up too well at the beyond the limits of my intellect to match you there. But we even within the conversation we've had, it would need translation materials in order to articulate it properly to patients if there was to be a fly on the wall in here. And I'm forever trying to work out whether or not we get the balance right within conversations, but also as a fraternity in Physio Matters, trying to work out how much we balance our material to the nerding out on the details and interrogating the details, but then always trying to keep in mind that that is useless without the ability to translate and articulate that in a language that is coherent for everyone, and particularly the people we work with to help them with their pain and injury. Thank you so much, Joe. It's absolutely fascinating to meander through some of this together. Really appreciate your time, and thank you, of course, for the discount code on your book. We will be shouting about that everywhere we shout about things. And thank you all for listening. This has been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much, Jack. Thank you for having me.
No worries. My pleasure. Take care. He says. This is where I scramble to try and find the off button. I don't want to end. I don't want to end the call. Can't believe we did it in one take, and he's still going to have to edit out my clumsy. Oh, there we go. There we go. Stop recording. And we're back. Wow, thanks so much to Joanne Elphinston for sharing some of her time with me. It was absolutely fascinating, and the cogs are turning frantically for me trying to work out where all of this sits and how I can integrate it into my practice. Massive reflections on some of the areas in which I need to try and work out as to how I can try to understand integrating beautiful movement, integrating ways in which symptoms resolve. Am I obsessing over why something works more than I should do? And is it that really when someone like Joe's an incredibly unique sort of artistic figure in this space, is there a je ne sais quoi that is me that I'm going to sort of spoil by trying to put my finger on it or understand it or think about almost falsifiability, either by argumentation or by the blunt instruments of science? I don't know. I don't know. I'm absolutely fascinated as I try to get my head around that, and I think future conversations between us two, as well as then involving you all in this, would only help. And I know that that's something that me and Joe, are both passionate about. So hope you enjoyed this conversation. I hope it left you wanting more. I know it does me, and I know that Joe's well up for further conversations, especially because we've got so many colleagues and collaborators in common that I think our paths are bound to cross and stay crossed now. or on the same path now. So that would be really cool to enhance this even further. If you haven't already, check out rehabmypatient.com/physiomatters for a 3-month free trial on their exercise prescription software. Whether you're in the NHS, private practice, sport, or occupational health, they are the best in the biz, especially because we know that how important it is to have the time, all the time you can with the patients, and their integrations are second to none. So do check them out, and thank you as ever to them for supporting what we do and the important work that you guys seem to enjoy. We've got 4 masterclass events coming up. And they are all now for sale. So do check out physio-matters.com for all things events, which of course all get recorded and put onto the library for you wonderful members of our community who can access then what is now the largest MSK library in the world. So thank you as ever for all your support, and please do let us know how you're enjoying all of our content, including this. So take care, and because this is a unique special episode, I get a chance to do our cheesy sign out for the first time in ages, which is a great pleasure for me. You might want to switch off now if you don't like the cheese, but you've been listening to the Physio Matters podcast, discussing physio matters because physio matters. Bye for now.